Good morning, everybody. This is a new seminar in our project, Striking from the Margin, Religion, State, and Disintegration in the Middle East. As many of you are aware that the concept of margin is crucial in our project. And in today's seminar, we deal with how a certain margin, in very particular time and context, reacted to actions and policies adopted and operated by the center, being at the time the main colonial power. Dr. Ute Falasch presentation will examine the religious, social, as well as economic roles of Sufi and Hindu ascetics that brought them into conflict with the British East India Company in the 18th century. It also sheds light on the ongoing debate about how to judge and classify the fight of the Muslim and Hindu ascetics, which also found its echo in the Hindu nationalist discourse. Dr. Falasch currently is visiting research fellow at the Center for Religious Studies at the Central European University. She graduated in South Asian Studies and Islamic Studies at Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, where she received both her MA and PhD degree. She also studied at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, medieval Indian history. In her PhD thesis, Dr. Falasch focused on the Madariya, a South Asian Sufi brotherhood using an interdisciplinary approach that combined a multi-sited anthropological fieldwork with the historical approach based on sources. Her findings brought significant and new insights to the study of wandering groups of Sufi in South Asia.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to today's lecture, and I hope I can give some interesting insights into the uprisings that happened in the 18th century, from the mid of the 18th century in Bengal, when the the British East India Company established its political power over that region. I would like to start with that picture of the tomb of Majnun Shah, which is in Makkanpur. Makkanpur is a small town village in Uttar Pradesh, India. And Majnun Shah was a fakir in the Madariya Sufi brotherhood, which is mainly a South Asian brotherhood. You just heard that. Just as a background information, the brotherhood was founded in the 15th century by the Syrian Sufi Badi'uddin Shah Madar, who came from Aleppo on a long journey to India. And while renouncing fakirs who opt for celibacy and itinerancy, were and are a reality in all South Asian Sufi brotherhoods, in the Madariya, this form of piety gained a much greater importance. The number of fakirs was and is much higher, and the brotherhood had a larger degree of organization. The fakirs in the Madariya are called, sorry, how do I switch it on again? Sorry. This is tricky. It's just so I just continue. So the fakirs in the Madariya are called Malang, and I will use that term to describe the fakirs in the Madariya. So, and often they have the title Shah, so that's why. Just to get a little idea of how they look like, this is a picture of the current head of the Malang in the Madariya, because we do not have any pictures of Majnun Shah. So, Majnun Shah lived in the 18th century in India. He was born probably, we are not completely sure, in Mewat, a region just south of Delhi. And he fought against the British East India Company in Bengal and died because of a wound he got in a battle. in Makanpur in 1787, and there he lies buried. For a long time, his tomb, which is at a central place in Makanpur, didn't get much attention, so it was just a normal tomb like all the other ones in the village. But in the past 2 years, members of the Madariya in Makanpur felt the need to bring him back into focus and to remember him as one of the first Indian freedom fighters against the British. Actually, it was not only Madanu Shah, but the entire resistance from the side of the Malang, as well as that of sannyasins renouncing Hindu ascetics in Bengal, who fought together at times against the company, and of which Madanu Shah was the most important leader. This resistance is mostly forgotten in today's India as well as in Pakistan. The reasons for that are complex. On the one hand, the resistance of the Malang and the sannyasis was part of a number of uprisings against the company. And on the other hand, the perception of the resistance ranges from perceiving the Malang as the saviors of the Bengali peasants up to image of them as being bandits, marauders, a group who terrorized the Bengali population. And of course, in India, there have been later events, such as the Indian rebellion from 1857-58, which is also called the First War of Independence, and from the British side, still called the Great Mutiny. The uprising of the Malang and sannyasis is well remembered in Bangladesh today. There has been a film made about the Fakir Madanu Shah, and a bridge is named after him. So, in the following presentation, I would like to speak about the religious, as you heard, the religious, social, and also economic roles Malang and sannyasis played in 18th century India, with a special focus to Bengal, of course, and I will then speak about the changes the politics of the British East India Company brought to Bengali society and their effects on Malang and the sannyasis. In this context, I will draw upon the Hindu ascetics that united forces with the Malang at times, and I will also try to characterize the form of the rebellion or uprising and the British reaction to it. In the second part, I would like to speak shortly about the highly contradictory perception the uprising met in the public discourse as well as in academics. And finally, I would like to draw upon a novel that was published in 1882, the Anandamat, the Abbey of Bliss, which was written by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, that in a very peculiar way picks up the sannyasi uprising and gives it a completely new turn. And here in this novel is incorporated the hymn Vande Mataram, and I will focus shortly on the ways it has been used in Indian and Hindu nationalist movements. So let me first go back to the roles Malang of the Madariya played in Bengali society. And actually this is not an easy task because we do not have many sources. And especially when we compare the Madariya Sufi Brotherhood to other brotherhoods who were active in Bengal, so we have much less sources. However, in an indirect way, it is possible to somehow retrace their roles as caretakers of Sufi shrines or religious guides. Between the 15th and 17th century, we see in Bengal a process of land cultivation combined with the founding of towns. Especially the Mughal administration used the practice of the assignment of land grants to landholders as well as to religious persons, such as Sufis, caretakers of mosques of Brahmins, in order to promote the cultivation of land and to extend their political influence in these regions. In these new foundations of places, we find sacred buildings that ensured the exemption from the revenue. Those places often derive their names from the affiliation of the founder, and therefore we find in Bengal towns which have the name Madari in it, such as Madaripur or Madari Tola. Also, folk ballads hint to the fact that the veneration of Shah Madar, the founder of the Madariya, as a saint was rather popular all over Bengal, and there was an annual festival in spring in commemoration of the saint. As Malang in the Madariya have the function of transmitting the hagiographical tradition about Shah Madar and Sufis of the Madariya, as well as the legends about the miraculous powers, it can be assumed on the basis of the degree of institutionalized saint veneration that Malang were an essential part of the religious life in Bengal in the Mughal period and beyond. There's another source that sheds light on the role of Malang in Bengal. It is a Sanad government decree issued by Shah Muhammad Shuja, the second son of the Emperor Shah Jahan and the governor of the province of Bengal, on behalf of Shah Sultan Hassan Muria Burhana, a Malang, who had his abode in a village in northwest Bengal. The Sanad is dating from 1655 and speaks of the considerable influence the Malang had in that region and in that period. It is not simply another land grant, as the many examples we have of assignments Sufis were granted, but it assigns a number of privileges as well. In the Sanad, Shah Shuja declares Shah Burhana a respected saint. He is deeply convinced of his high spiritual qualities and knowledge, and therefore he grants several rights that aim at supporting the saint as a religious authority, such as the right to travel freely in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, carrying along all banners, standards, and drums according to his rank. For the standards, he's using the term Mahi Maratib, and this is very interesting as Mughal rulers used different symbols and insignia which were carried along during campaigns, and drums were beaten at the head of the procession. Of the insignia, some were subjected to the ruler only, such as the throne and the umbrella. Others could be awarded as honors to princes or great nobles. They were denoted by the figure of the fish emblem, Mahi, and other insignia, mostly two balls, Marathi. The insignia designating his rank were to be transferred to his successors after his death, so the insignia were not just assigned to Burhana, but also to his successors. Furthermore, through the Sanad, the Shah received the right to confiscate land that had no heir or revenue-free land. Moreover, he was authorized to give guidance to the people, as well as to ensure the maintenance of the faith, as well as the law in the country. Furthermore, it is stated that on his way, landlords and farmers should provide him with food. Finally, the Pargana Bais Hazari, which was an assignment to the shrine of the Suhrawadi, Shah Jalal ad-Din Tabrizi, was assigned to Burhana, and as far as it is known, it was the biggest land grant in Bengal. So on the basis of these sources from the 17th and also from later 18th centuries, it can be assumed that Malang usually had a fixed abode, often close to a shrine of a saint of that brotherhood and probably funded by endowments. Itinerancy was not a full-time employment, but it was carried out on a part-time basis. Malang undertook pilgrimages in annual cycles according to the dates of major festivals of shrines or markets in the region and beyond. Regularly, these pilgrimages led to Makanpur, as well, the Brotherhood Center. Malang wandered alone or in groups, carrying with them the symbols and standards that designated their affiliation to the Madariya. On the way, they lived on alms, which they asked of the people in the villages. The mobility of the Malang always has been an essential aspect of the Madariya Sufi Brotherhood. On the one hand, through the pilgrimage, new territories could be opened up, in which followers of the Brotherhood settled to spread their spiritual concepts, initiate new disciples. On the other hand, the regular contact to the descendants of Shah Madar and spiritual heads of the Madariya in Makanpur could be maintained. Commonly, Malang have recruited new disciples from the lower social strata, and because of their status as wandering mendicants, they moved outside of social hierarchies as well as established religious and political authorities. And in this way, beyond the possibility to move up into higher cycles, yet due to their proximity to the social sphere of their origin, especially in the rural area, as well as their role as custodians of saint veneration, they occupied the space of religious authority in this social sphere more effectively than religious scholars, for instance. It can be assumed that in this role, they were patronized by the political authorities and aristocracy during the Mughal period and shortly afterwards. And it was exactly this role and self-concept that brought the Malang in Bengal into conflict with the British East India Company shortly after it was granted the post of Diwan for the provinces of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha in the year 1765 by the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. The Diwan included the right to collect the revenues and taxes of all these three regions. The British East India Company was granted the Diwan in a period that was highly dynamic in India. While the Mughal Empire experienced an increasing state of decline after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, we see in different areas successful processes of state building with local manifestations. Administrative and fiscal reforms were combined with the building of efficient bureaucracies and powerful armies. Furthermore, a new system of fiscalism was introduced in which the state awarded contracts and reduced taxes to promote the economy. This in turn led to the formation of a new layer of trans-regional banking families, trans-regional traders and middlemen with a broad network of customers. We see a gradual population growth and an increasing urbanity. The British managed to build successfully on those processes and dynamics that were favorable to their enterprise and at the same time suppressed those who they regarded as a hindrance. In the course of time, a combination of different political, military and economic strategies helped the company to become a political power, first in Bengal, then in North India and finally in nearly the entire subcontinent. Originally founded as an English and later British joint stock company that was formed to pursue trade with the East Indies, it is, as all the other European East India companies, an institutional innovation, as the private company of trade was awarded certain privileges by the state that were sovereign rights in form of a charter that included trade monopoly in certain regions, tax exemption, the right to conclude contracts, and furthermore to wage wars and to maintain armed forces. From the midst of the 18th century, the company underwent a gradual but profound institutional metamorphosis from a trading company to a colonial agency. The first step was the growing importance of military confrontation with a gradual transition from a broadening of the economic and fiscal base to primarily security policy and strategically justified actions. Since the maintenance of the military and bureaucracy is expensive, the second step was the development of a tax-raising institution. In 1757, the company participated in a coup d'etat in Bengal, organized by influential merchants and rajas with the aim of gaining control over certain areas in Bengal, which culminated in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the British under Robert Clive defeated the Bengali Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Second Bengal War in 1764, which ended with the Battle of Buxar and the victory of the British Indian troops against the combined armies of the Mughal Emperor, the Nawab of Bengal and the Nawab of Awadh, led to the de facto disempowerment of the Nawab of Bengal and, as already mentioned, to the assignment of the Diwani to the British. So what we see here is that the East India Company has had a clearly hybrid character as an institution, and this is reflected by subsequent decisions. For instance, the British Parliament decided in 1767, so 2 years after granting of the Diwani, to deduct a part of the tax and customs revenue from India, who significantly affected the company's profit. At the same time, the company decided to stop importing silver as a payment for Indian goods and to finance it from Bengal revenue. Even if the company more and more acted as a colonial agency on behalf of the crown, its ultimate purpose as a profit-making agency, always with an eye to its shareholders, and the annual dividend remained an essential factor of the company throughout its existence. This was the main reason why, at first, administrative duties have not been a priority for the company. It rather reacted to pressing necessities. In the beginning, it relied on Bengali agencies to levy taxes, which, however, resulted in a rather chaotic state of things, and subsequently in the appointment of Warren Hastings as Governor General in 1772. So until the end of the 18th century, the colonial state remained to some extent an administrative superstructure. However, the economic and social changes for various groups of the society were immense. So the introduction of monopols on profitable products such as salt, betel nut, tobacco and saltpeter repressed Bengali merchants. The same effect had the installment of middlemen, so-called gumashtas, between craftsmen and the company, who wielded considerable power, especially over the craftsmen. For instance, weavers were forced to work for the British company exclusively on a fixed price. In the agricultural sector, the granting of titles of land to a new class of landlords, the so-called zamindars, with the aim to maximize revenue, led to a higher burden on the peasants and an impoverishment of traditional zamindars. All of these measures immediately led to a number of violent protests and upheavals of different groups in the Bengali population, and they got an entire new dynamic after severe droughts in the years of 1769 and 77, and a subsequent famine to which about 10 million Bengalis fell victim, and it was estimated that this was about 1/3 of the entire Bengali rural population. This led to a long-term depopulation of entire areas, which in turn resulted in a crop failure and thus the impoverishment of the rural population and traditional zamindars. So William Hunter, an Indian civil servant, described in detail the devastating effects 30 years later, and he is he's the only one who does not hold back with harsh criticism of the disastrous policy of the Calcutta Council, because despite alarming reports from Indian officials, no measures were taken to somehow fight the worst consequences of the famine. So Hunter explains the indifference of the British as follows. Until 1772, Bengal was regarded by the British public in the light of a waste warehouse in which a number of adventurous Englishmen carried on business with great profit and on an enormous scale. That a numerous native population existed, they were aware, but this they considered an accidental circumstance. The famine resulted in a significant law and order problem for the British, as there were a number of vagrant groups of landless peasants who either joined those groups that organized uprisings against the British, but were often impoverished peasants formed into bands and committed robberies to secure their survival. Regardless of the social problems and the human disaster, all these groups were viewed and persecuted by the British as criminals, and a term which derives from Hindustani, Dakites for bandit, was generally used for them. As I said before, the changes in the society brought by the company had effects on the Malang and Hindu ascetics as well. And as in the colonial literature and also in subsequent academic works until today, the Malang and the Hindu ascetics are often lumped together under the term sannyasin, which is a term for an Hindu ascetic. They designate, and their religious traditions hardly differentiated. I would like to point out shortly parallels and differences among them. So, sannyasin form one of the many Hindu sects of world-renouncing and celibate ascetics who belong to the Shaivite tradition in Hinduism. Institutionally, they are organized in monasteries and headed by a religious leader. They do finance themselves through donations or land grants, but they're also engaged in various economic fields throughout North India. On the one hand, the monastery possessed assets and estates. On the other hand, the Hindu ascetics engage as landlords, as zamindars, as traders, and extremely successful as bankers and moneylenders. Especially in the 18th century, the importance of sannyasis as traders and moneylenders in northern India and Bengal had increased. In this uncertain political situation, they could rely on a complex organizational network, and Bernard S. Cohn has described it as the ready-made trading network. In this way, it enabled them not only to maintain trade with commodities such as raw silk, copper, and cotton, and even to become the dominant, they even could become the dominant group here. The basis of their trading network was the annual pilgrimage, on which the ascetics traveled long distances on mostly fixed route in large parts of the subcontinent. So in around 70-80, the sannyasis were financially the strongest group in the cities of Allahabad, Varanasi, and Mirzapur and Nagpur. I mentioned shortly they wanted in armed groups. So the perception that a Hindu ascetic is an essential peaceful ascetic is not attainable. Groups of Shaivite and Vishnuite ascetics probably began to organize in military regiments, akharas, as early as the 13th century. It is a bit difficult to exactly pinpoint when this tradition started. There were different reasons for the armament. There were persecutions of ascetics or the destruction of religious institutions by kings, which often had economic reasons and not so much religious reasons. But there were also violent conflicts between rival religious sects. In the period of state formation in the 18th century, Hindu ascetics also took a new military dimension because they no longer organized in armed regiments only, but became troops of mercenaries, which could have a strength up to 5,000 men. And they entered into the service of various rulers, and so war became a means of substance for them. In contrast to the Hindu ascetics, Malang of the Madariya in Bengal were generally not zamindars, traders or professional moneylenders. We have no hints that the Malang of the Madariya engaged in any way in those kinds of businesses. So for them, the care and upkeep of shrines, financed by revenue-free land donations, as well as the annual pilgrimage, remained basic features of their religious practice. their main area in Bengal was central Bengal, but where Shamada is worshipped to this day. But the pilgrimage routes went beyond central Bengal, so one has to. So it's not that all Malang wandered on the same route, but there have been different groups of Malang. Some Malang also wandered alone. So different Malang had different routes in Bengal. It depended on the affiliation to a Sufi guide, which route they followed. But what always happened, they met at certain times, at certain festivals, at certain shrines. And all their routes also went outside of Bengal to places which were as well important for the Madariya. And of course here the center of the Sufi Brotherhood, Makanpur in Uttar Pradesh. The map is a map from, it's a modern map, but still, I don't know if you can see at least a little bit, Uttar Pradesh. So Makanpur is in today's Uttar Pradesh, and the routes actually went up to Rajasthan and Gujarat. And also contrary to the tradition of the sannyasis, there is no hint anywhere that Malang wandered armed, just except a traditional dagger, before the confrontation with the British East India Company. So there are a number of parallels between these two groups, of course concerning theological concepts and also forms of their ascetic piety. There are parallels in their appearance, like the entangled hair, like wearing chains around the neck, like carrying standards who designate the affiliation of the ascetic. But commonly it was that Malang had been wearing black or dark blue clothes, while the sannyasis wore saffron or orange-colored clothes. So there were also clear similarities in their religious roles as spiritual guides, caretakers of sacred places, and of course, most important, both groups shared the tradition of the annual pilgrimages through Bengal, where both lived on alms and the land grants. Yet, with regard to economic and military activities, those of the sannyasis was much more complex. In any case, in all of these aspects, Malang and sannyasis were affected by the changes which brought the East India Company into the Bengal society. So I don't want to go into detail into the effects on the economic enterprises of the sannyasis. I had referred to that before. So in all of these aspects, sannyasis were affected. Both groups suffered from the idea of the British to stop the exemption from revenue for land donations. So when the British became aware how big the areas are in Bengal, which were exempted from revenue, which there were several thousand square kilometers, they tried to find ways to put them under revenue. So this was one important threat, but actually the pilgrimage was the most important tradition both groups shared that brought them into the conflict with the British. In the British perception, Malang and sannyasis were depicted as groups of armed marauders who ravaged the country in great numbers, misusing their status as religious ascetics to plunder or abuse the hospitality of the population on their way, under the disguise of performing a religious pilgrimage. The British either did not perceive the pilgrimage as a religious practice at all, or at most interpreted it as a disguise of the Malang and sannyasis to plunder undisturbed. Their appearance and habits were seen as a threat to the formation of law and order, And no less important seems to have been, however, that through the collecting of arms, they diminished the revenue income. So it often happened that when the collector came to the villagers to ask for the revenue, that the villagers said, okay, the Malang just came and had gotten their arms and donations, so we cannot give any revenue anymore. Subsequently, they were labeled as bandits and dacoits. Yet the British reports also show that it was the prohibition of the pilgrimage and its suppression with military means, and in that way the criminalization of the Malang and sannyasis that caused the armed response by them. As early as in 1769, the company had instructed the supervisors to control, restrict, and as far as possible, stop the migrations of the fakirs and sannyasis to pilgrimage sites. And in the first encounter, there's a report of the first encounter of Malangs with a British official. They were not armed. And this experience seems to have been rather traumatic for the Malang, as later on Majnu Shah, the leader of the Malang, writes to Rani Bhabhani of Nator, an influential landlord, and asks for her assistance. He writes, we have for a long time backed and been entertained in Bengal, and we have long continued to worship God at the several shrines and altars without ever once abusing or oppressing anyone. Nevertheless, last 150 fakirs were without cause put to death. The merit which is derived and the reputation which is procured from the murder of the helpless and indigent need not to be declared. Formerly, the fakirs begged in separate and detached parties, but now we are all collected and back together. Displeased at this method, they, the British, obstruct us in visiting the shrines and other places. This is unreasonable. You are the ruler of the country. We are fakirs who always pray for your welfare. We are full of hopes. Another source shows that the Rani did not help. She actually sent a copy of this letter to the company. So the measures of the British resulted finally in a German guerrilla-like uprising on the side of the Malang and the sannyasis against the British Indian troops for the following 30 years. It is not really easy to somehow differentiate who was fighting, if it were sannyasis or if it was Malang, because the British were not always sure whom they actually met. So they often used the term sannyasi, but when we have names of the leaders, then it's often clear that they actually met Malang. So one can establish that most of the uprising was led by Malang, and they were joined by sannyasis at times. So sannyasis and Malang did not wander on the same pilgrimage routes, but they did met at certain times, and then they joined their forces and fought together against the Indian British troops. And in the early 1770s, many impoverished peasants who had survived the devastating famines joined the Ascetics on both sides, so that they sometimes wandered in groups of several thousand men. The uprising worked on different levels, so we do not have to imagine that there was a constant war going on. Actually, sannyasis and Malang continued their pilgrimages through Bengal, but now, as Majnu Shah also wrote in his letter, they wandered in big groups and they wandered armed. So the British actually knew when they would come, in which time they would come, and on which route they would wander through Bengal. So they sent their troops to those places, but as the Malang and the sannyasis knew the territory much better and had help from the local population, they could retreat quickly. So it is often reported that the British come with much better armed troops, the Malang just wait in the forest until the soldiers have fired their bullets, and then they come and fight them. And in that way, they often could win those confrontations. In their armament, the Malangan sannyasis were in the beginning very inferior to the British troops, but in the course of time, they managed to get hold of different kinds of weapons. They could capture matchlocks, and in one report we even hear of rockets. So there have been rockets in the 18th century, which the Malang transported on horses and camels. And they also identified so-called soft targets quite quickly. They directed their attacks against those places which brought the biggest harm to the East India Company. These were the factories, storehouses, as well as transports which carried the revenues. So they were trying to get at the company financially. But what we also see, and this is a reason why this uprising is discussed in a very controversial way, landlords who collaborated with the British, or those landlords who were installed by the British, as well as farmers who worked with the British, were attacked by the Malang and the sannyasis. So one author has done the effort to count the number of attacks and the aims. So he could show that purely British targets were much less than those of the Bengali population. Still, what is also clearly to be seen is that the Malang did not rob poor peasants, but the rich farmers and zamindars, and even the British had to attest them a kind of Robin Hood mentality. It certainly is not possible to discuss the uprisings in detail here. However, certain aspects are interesting in my opinion. As I mentioned, Malang are not known to have wandered armed, except of the traditional dagger before the incidents in Bengal. And also afterwards, they did not wander armed. So also in the 19th century, there are no reports that they were wearing any kinds of arms. Yet they managed rather quickly to arm and defend themselves, and most probably by using, as an example, the military traditions of the sannyasins with whom they fought at times. So it has been argued that the fights cannot be interpreted as a full-fledged rebellion or uprising against a foreign rule, but as a sequence of spontaneous fights without organization. However, presupposing that Malang had no military experience before, they built up a resistance that corresponded to their capacities, their knowledge of the region, and their lifestyle in a very short course of time. Malang organized a supply of weapons, of horses, and as I mentioned, camels. There is annual camel fair in Makampur on the basis of their widespread network, which they covered in regular wanderings, and that ranged not only up to Makampur, as I said already, but even as far as to Rajasthan and Gujarat on the west coast of India. So their strategy was built on their network on a South Asian scale. Also because they were able, so the South Asian scale shows itself also that they were able to support, to secure the support of the local population in the villages, but also from local rulers outside of the territory of India. So they had secured the support by neighboring rulers of Assam, Bhutan, Nepal, and Morang. So the British tried to to get those rulers in the neighboring states to throw the Malang out of their area, so when they were on the retreat. But we see that often those rulers chose to go on supporting the Malang. Furthermore, concerning their internal organization, it can be assumed that it was based on an intense guide-disciple relation. Majnu Shah had a number of disciples whom he trained for several years before they took up the course after Majnu died in 1787. We also see a clear expressed aim of the uprising, in my opinion. It is directed against the British and those in collaboration with them. Majnu Shah regarded the local zamindar as the legitimate ruler of the country. There is another source dating from 1781, which in my opinion speaks in the direction that the Malang were clearly aware of who the enemy was. It was the foreign rule of the British. So in this report, which is from a cantonment not very far from Makhanpur from Farrukhabad, it is reported that a fakir and his followers came to the cantonment and they tried to cause an upheaval among the soldiers by saying that the British would soon be expelled from the country, that the fakir is a forerunner of someone who would come and who would be victorious against the British so that they could be expelled from the country. So 1781 was in the midst of the uprising going on in Bengal, and we have a source of a fakir which we don't have his affiliation, but as Farrukhabad is very close to Makhanpur, and the influence of the Madariya in this area is very high. So we can see that there is a connection in today's Uttar Pradesh and former Awadh. In my opinion, this speaks of a clear awareness of who the enemy was at those times. So from the British side, we see that the magnitude of the Dakhite problem was immense. This is illustrated by measures taken by the Committee of Circuit under Warren Hastings in 1772. First of all, wandering groups were indiscriminately defined as born occupational criminals. Hastings wrote, "A race of outlaws who live from father to son in a state of warfare against society, plundering and burning villages and murdering the inhabitants." Warren Hastings ruled that the Hanafi law, which would actually be applicable to Indian Muslims, would not be applicable to those Dakhites. And in August 1771, the Regulation 35 was passed stipulating that every convicted Dakhite should be taken to his own village and executed in front of the family and neighbors, and afterwards his relatives should be sold in slavery. Yet Bengali judges refused to impose the death penalty, so this regulation was never really imposed. So a new ruling was passed where all vagabond groups should leave, according to which all vagabond groups should leave Bengal within 2 months, and anyone who is subsequently found should be sentenced to a lifelong road work and the entire property confiscated. I just said before that the uprising lasted for 30 years, so we have these rulings in the beginning of the 70s, and the reason why they had no effect, it was because it took about 30 years until the attempts to refer the criminal jurisdiction to the colonial administration. And at the same time, it took about 30 years until it was possible to have a systematic or a network of police stations throughout Bengal, and only by these measures, so on the one hand, the police stations, on the other hand, criminal jurisdiction, which was more in favor of the British perception of the bandit problem, helped us subsequently to curtail the uprisings of the sannyasis and Malang. I said before that the perception of the uprising is in India very contradictory. It is, as I said, in Bangladesh not. There it is seen as an uprising against the British, one of the first uprisings which led to independence. In Pakistan, it is not remembered at all. There is no awareness that it ever happened. In West Bengal, we do have academic writers who deal with these with this uprising, and here we have very different opinions. I think, in my opinion, the main reason is that the sources we can rely on are dominantly British, and in the British reports we have sometimes very detailed reports of what was going on in those times, and at the same time, of course, a very clear judgment that the Malang and the sannyasis were bandits, were marauders, and groups that terrorized the Bengali population. Then there are folk ballads. This is before independence, so it applies to the entire Bengal. In some ballads, it's very clear that the Malang are the saviors of the peasants who supported them against the British, and then we have those who exactly say that the Malangs were killing the peasants. So, in academic works, we see both as well. We have Marxist approaches who see the uprising as a peasant uprising, and the Malang and the sannyasis, the political leaders, with a clear aim to fight for an independence. On the other hand, we have those works who clearly say that it was not an uprising against the British, but that Malang and sannyasis used the chaotic political situation in the country to just exploit the population. It's interesting that authors of the subaltern studies groups did not deal with the uprising and role of the Malang. Scholars of the subaltern studies group focus on the grassroots perspective. Yet Ranajit Guha, the founder of the group, briefly comments on the uprising, and he falls into the category of those who don't see any positive aspects in this uprising. So he writes, these Huns, as we are in Hungary, so the term Hun, I think, is very rare here. These Huns with no local roots terrorized the countryside as much as did the Maratha horsemen in the troubled years of Ali Wardi's rule, and were no more friends of the peasantry than the armed levies of the revenue farmers themselves. So it's interesting that he compares Malang and sannyasis with Huns, and as he has here the same approach as the colonial view. And in my opinion, he denies the peasants their religious worldview, where the Malang were considered authorities, and the question of whether they were native of the country or not did not arise. And what I think is problematic is here is that the logic of Malang and sannyasi not having local roots, so being foreign, alien, which is inherent in Guha's formulation, ultimately leads to a communal discourse. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I just have to make this very short. The the uprising, also this is really, I think in my opinion, why in India this uprising is not remembered as an uprising by Sufis and Hindu ascetics against the British, because we do have the novel Ananda Math from 1882, written by Bankim Chattopadhyay. I mentioned him in the beginning. Bankim was a very prolific writer, and he was able to create very powerful characters in his novels. And the Ananda Math is a turning point from Hindu revivalism. Hindu revivalism, and so far, had not focused on the Muslim as an enemy, but focused on a reform of the Hindu, because Hindu struggled with their identity, because British saw them as effeminate. Hindus asked the question why they have been ruled by foreigners for hundreds of years. There were repeated attempts by the British to reform Hindu traditions, and there was missionary work going on. All these, it's a very complex background, but all this led to a revivalism which were focused on the Hindu identity. But with the Ananda Math, we have a clear shift, a turn from the revivalism to a communal approach, because what Bankim is doing here, he sets his novel in the time of the famine, and very vividly describes the impoverished peasants and the disaster that happened, the catastrophe. He speaks of cannibalism, and he somehow does not identify the peasant as an able actor to fight against the British, but it is these are upper caste Hindus who choose to become sannyasis to be able to fight the ruler, the Muslims, the Nawab Muslims. So Bankim sets in that novel, creates in his novel a holy war of Hindu ascetics against the Muslim ruler. The British do play a role, and at the end they are the ones who will rule the country, but their role is somehow very marginal. And Bankim manages to create this very powerful picture by inventing a new goddess who represents the nation of India. So he picks up aspects of the goddess Durga, the one who is a very powerful goddess, and now it is the nation and the goddess at the same time. So we have a confluence of the religious side with the nation. So the Hindu is asked to worship that new goddess and to become a true patriot. And the only way to become a patriot is by sacrificing their own life for this goddess. It is very, the language is very harsh, directed against Muslims. So Bankim in earlier novels does not write against Muslims at all, but here we have it, and it's we have those sentences like go out and kill those Muslims, kill them, shoot them in the back, and all these sentences which make very clear that to become a real Hindu, a neo-Hindu, it is necessary to expel those, he uses the word swine as well, from the country. In this novel we see, we have the hymn Vande Mataram, which is again very interesting. Vande Mataram was written by Bankim before he wrote Ananda Math, but he incorporated it into the novel. And here it's a poem which speaks of the goddess, the mother goddess which is the country at the same time, which nourishes its children. And then it goes on that the goddess Durga becomes the fighting goddess who has to defend, or for whom their children have to defend the country, and in the end it goes back to be the peaceful goddess who nourishes her children. It is a very powerful poem, and that's why it gained, it was very popular in the Indian as well as Hindu nationalist movement against the British. And it was set into music by Rabindranath Tagore and sung by the Indian National Congress since 1894. Yet they were singing just the first two stanzas because then it is a clear religious focus in the poem, and of course there were Muslims in the Congress as well, so one decided for the first two stanzas. But till this day, the RSS, which is the militant wing of Hindu nationalism, as the militant organization of the Hindu nationalist organizations in India, is singing the complete Vande Mataram from start to the end. And as I said, Vande Mataram has been always very popular and is still popular now, as with BJP in power. We again have the discussion that Vande Mataram should actually be the national anthem of India, which was decided against after the independence, because of course political leaders were aware of the complicated history of Vande Mataram and Ananda Mat for Muslims. So so what we do see now, and I'm just doing that very shortly, is that when we see an official display of Vande Mataram, we always have images of the different religions in India. It's very important that they are somehow included. So, okay. Just very shortly, maybe that you get an sorry. So there will be a mosque, there will be an Islamic tomb, you will have different leaders of independence with different religious affiliations. And Matuje Salam, okay. The greetings of the mother, with the term from the Islamic Islamic greeting. So, just to finish the lecture, why do people in Makhanpur, where the tomb of Majnu Shah is, now feel that they should show that actually here they have one of the first freedom fighters in India. Vande Mataram is used as a litmus test for Indian Muslims today to prove if they are true Indian patriots or if they are they maybe feel closer to Pakistan. So what we do see rather often is that Muslims are questioned, that they should make clear that they do respect, accept, and assimilate to the majority tradition, which is a Hindu tradition. So we have just, this is one example of videos you find on YouTube, why Muslims don't say Vande Mataram. And Muslims have to show that they are
कुछ मुस्लिम नेताओं ने भारतीय मुसलमानों को वंदे मातरम कहने से मना किया है। हमें यूट्यूब पे नेशनैलिटी हमें यूट्यूब पे को मानता है तो वो बोलेगा ये बात रॉन्ग है, सिर्फ अल्लाह है जो सर हमारा झुकेगा, सिर्फ उसके आगे झुकेगा। हम निराकार ब्रह्म की उपासना करते हैं, जिसका कोई आकार नहीं है, हम उसकी उपासना करते हैं।
और वंदे मातरम कह देगा तो वो चलेगा नहीं मुसलमान को, वो सर कटा सकता है लेकिन वो बात नहीं करेगा।
मुसलमान जो है अपने धर्म का पालन करेगा, वो जो मुल्क का जो एहतराम है वो अपने हिसाब से करेगा, किसी के कहने के ऊपर, किसी के बताने के ऊपर, किसी के चिल्लाने के ऊपर वो नहीं करेगा।
ये सब कोई बात नहीं, सारे आदमी बोलते हैं, सब कुछ सबको बोलते हैं।
From all these people who were interviewed, there's actually just one person who is able to relate the Vande Mataram to the.
उस देश का अगर हम नमक खाते हैं तो हमें उसके साथ इस तरह से बातें नहीं करनी चाहिए।
हम इंडिया में रहते हैं, वंदे मातरम बोलने में हमें कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं।
और नॉवल में ये जो गाना है आनंद राइट, वो मुसलमानों के खिलाफ है। And being a Muslim, I hate that novel. But I love Vande Mataram. It's just like I love the song Yerua, but Dilwale sucks. तो आप कैमरा पे एक बार वंदे मातरम कह सकते हैं?
Hindustan.
Okay, so that is the reason why in Makampur nowadays Madaris feel the need to show that also in their tradition they have members who fought against the British and they fought together with Hindu sannyasis. Thank you.
Okay, we have 20 minutes. Let's open for discussion, questions.
May I start? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I always imagined that the first trick of the colonialists is the divide et impera. You try to find the internal division, the internal conflict, and then try to get into this conflict by opposing groups one against each other. And you seem to show, as far as I understood, that the British failed in this completely.
Yeah, because they had no idea, they didn't understand what was going on.
Against the Hindus. Why did they fail?
Because they didn't understand what was going on. They just couldn't identify those groups. They, as I said, often they just put them all under the name Sannyasi. And then when you just see the names, you see this was not a sannyasi, it was a Malang. There was a Sufi tradition. So actually, there are very rare sources who actually see that there's a Sufi tradition. So Malang come from a completely different background than sannyasi. So I think it is it's a myth to think that the British in the 18th century had a clear idea of what they were encountering. So what we actually see from the British sources is that they didn't understand the country at all. So they didn't understand the population, they didn't understand the languages that were spoken. They tried to somehow come to terms with the law problem, because with the granting of the Diwani, it was not only the revenue, it was also that the jurisdiction fell into their hands, and they struggled for quite a long time to find ways to organize that. So in the beginning, they just left things as they were, and just in the course of time, so Warren Hastings actually started the idea that he should bring scholars, Orientalists from Great Britain, who first start to study the language, and then the religious books, and then the law books, to get an idea of what was actually going on in the country. And then afterwards, which also had this very difficult effect that when the British got an idea about the law, they started to identify a Hindu law and a Muslim law, which for which they always try to go back to the original texts, and on the basis of the original text, law then was spoken. While law, of course, always is a very flexible corpus which has to be adapted to realities. But this took time. It starts only in the 19th century. So in this period, they had to, let's say, act blindly, quite often. So they really didn't understand what it was they encountered. That's why they couldn't have. There were not those effective measures. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. For me, it appeared very interesting this role of pilgrimage in the story which you told. So as it was first, as much as I get, the basis for commerce and for tax collection, and later became the main axis of the warfare. So maybe can you elaborate more about how was it really such a crucial social institution or institution of power relation, pilgrimage in that area in that time?
Yeah, it is, and it is. How to say? So the piety of the Malang cannot exist without the pilgrimage. So the pilgrimage actually is this essential core of their form of piety, because I think I didn't mention that. So it's on the one hand that Malang do live on alms. For the sannyasis, this is much more complex, and I'm speaking about the sannyasis, but we have to keep in mind there are different groups of sannyasis, and some monasteries are really rich, so there is no question for going out and asking for alms anymore because the donations come in. So for the Malang it is different. It's not only that they do collect alms while wandering, so they have their fixed routes where the villagers know them, they know when they come. And when the Malang come, it's not just that they ask for the money, so they stay in every place for some time, because they do act as spiritual guides in those places. As religious authorities, they discuss with their disciples in those times. They help villagers with different kinds of problems. And what is also very important for Malang, for, let's say, all fakirs and all South Asian brotherhoods, and every festivals at shrines, so especially during the Urs of the Sufi buried in the Dargah, so the annual death anniversary of a Sufi, certain rituals are performed, and we often see that certain rituals can only be performed by a fakir and not by others, because fakirs are the ones who fast, who pray, and to have the spiritual power to perform the ritual, one has to live in such a way. So it's actually that also the people at the shrines are waiting for the fakirs to come to be part of those rituals. So it works on both sides. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, so one of the interesting parts of your presentation is the immense variety of reception among different groups today in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the event of Vande Mataram. So I was wondering why, for example, there is such disregard in Pakistan, and in other regions it's different. Because I'm sorry if I'm asking a self-evident question.
No,
as
it's
a
not.
person who is not, familiar with the context, I was wondering why. And for example, is it related to the current political discourse in these countries as well? So if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, of course it is. It's not. It's really something one has to think about for a moment. I think if you ask a Pakistani, he will not know about it. He will never have heard about it. The reasons here again, I think you cannot just have one reason. But for Pakistan, the partition of India is such a big event in the common awareness of history that. After that, it is necessary to create an identity of a Pakistani nation, and then you have the Bangladeshi independence in 1971. So, to relate to an incident in Bengal where Sufis wandering Sufis who also in Pakistani society are not, do not have the best image. I should maybe add that from their religious outlook. There's nothing to gain from. So what is remembered in Pakistan is the Great Rebellion from 1857, 58, because there it was mostly Muslims who led the rebellion. But it is really, there was like a break after partition, so one has to create a new identity because one cannot really relate to what is on the other side of the border. But in Bangladesh it's completely different. So there is the experience of 1971, the war for the independent Bangladeshi identity, and here it is easy, or it adds to that identity if one can draw back and rely on several uprisings, which finally led to that war, which gave the Bangladeshis their own country. So it is easily incorporated. And in India, I think there were lots of other events that happened. So there's the Great Rebellion, of course, which is there in the memory. But yeah, I also think that those processes and dynamics which went on at the end of the 19th century, the Hindu revivalism, which finally led to communalism, so an identity of a Hindu which is directed, and the Muslim who is seen as an enemy, makes it difficult to remember those times. And then, okay, it's also the sources is difficult. We have British sources. We have to rely on them, and that makes it so difficult to remember. While in the mid-19th century, from the Great Rebellion, there are lots of sources written by Indians also who reflect on those incidents, but there's just one letter of Majnu Shah, that's it. So, yeah, there is no final answer to that. It's a complex matter.
Thank you. You partially answered this by saying that you don't have many sources from this side. You have mainly British sources. So I don't know if, because my question would be then, if we look at their reports, whatever we have on that side, what would be their rhetoric against British? How would they refer to them? How would they call them? Would it be more a religious vocabulary or social, more in the social connotations? How were they referring to the other side, to the British?
You mean in Malang about the British?
Yes, Malangs and sannyasis, like what would be their rhetorics and vocabulary?
Yeah, as I said, it's...
So the sources, we do not...
it's so limited. So there is an understanding that this is a political role.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned about this.
Yes, but
not Marxist, all kinds of...
No. I mean, no. What the Malang perceived the British, how to say, as a foreign rule. I would say that. So in the political terms, not in religious terms, not in social terms, in political terms, as a foreign rule, which this is disastrous for the population. Yeah.
May I push the question a bit forward, because you are mentioning about the silence of the subaltern studies group regarding this, and Ganesh Guha basically designating them as Khans and terrorizing the countryside, etc.
Yeah.
But one of the assumptions on which subaltern studies launched itself was the insensitivity of the Marxist groups about the role played by religions in mobilizing, politics, and they call it as pre-political, etc., etc. And here there's a clear case of religion coming into play. And you said about the shared religious practices, shared religious geography, etc. So in this context, even if it is British sources, going by Ganesh Guha's idea of reading against the grain, what sort of political theology, basically, one can find out of these discourses. How the morality of resistance is explained in the religious vocabulary? Is there any instances, like that?
Yeah, again, so we have one letter of Madariya where we have words of one person. So what we do, what we can say, also trying to make out from the British sources, because as I said, they are rather detailed, so they are very clear in their judgment, but they are detailed in description. So sometimes one can try to have the perspective from the other side. What I see here on the side of the Malang is that the self-concept as being religious authorities in the area of their activities, so here especially in Bengal, but not only in Bengal, as I had the example from Ahmad. How to say, a healthy society has several layers, and one aspect in this society which is functioning and which is everyone can profit from is a society where you have Malang as religious authorities for the rural population. So that is a clear self-concept, and as I said, the Mughal administration always patronized those groups in this role, and out of this perception Malang clearly see that what the British are doing is completely against this idea. The British don't understand at all what's going on. It's just a criminalization which is going on. And this is what they fight against. So if you would have a political aim of the uprising, which is again very difficult to establish, then it would be to expel the British from the country and to reintroduce the form of rule which was before. Because that was for the Malang and the sannyasis, the rule which patronized them. But I'm not really sure if I answered your question.
May I join Dr. Varghese with very similar question, because there is this idea of reading the British sources against the grain, which is very fundamental for the subaltern studies, and which I find very questionable. Because what I found, but not in North India, but in South India, is that we have plenty and plenty and plenty of local sources, and we are not reading them. So the question is whether there are local sources, wherever I went, be it, but in Kerala, be it Christian communities, Muslim communities, I found the most incredible sources. For example, if I can relate to one experience in Ponani, I go to a mosque, and there is a writing on the wall in Garshuni Malayalam, a prophecy, 19th century prophecy about the political situation, naming Russia as the agent of the Satan, and in southwestern India. I don't know why they were so keen on thinking about Russia. So it's all in religious vocabulary. So what Dr. Varghese would like to know, and I would also like to know, what was the ideology? How did they justify what was the Muslim theological setting in which the Malang placed their uprising? Because I'm 100% sure that there was such a thing.
I didn't know if I mentioned it, but those authors who worked on the uprising, on the fights, on the events, are from Bengal, and of course they used everything what was there in Bengali as well. So they did not rely only on the British sources. The problem is, from this period, from the uprising itself, what we found so far, maybe we stumble over it one day, I don't know, there are very few. So the Bengali sources started later. They are in retrospect on the incidents that happened there. And so if you would ask for the Muslim theological concept of the Malang, one would have to go to the basis of Majnu Shah. We know he died in Makanpur, but in Makanpur I couldn't find any written source which would give insights in his ideology. There are no written sources from him. So we do have actually from the Madariya, I just have to repeat that again and again, it's very difficult to study the Madariya on the basis of written sources earlier than the 19th century, which are written by themselves. So again, this is, but I try to say that it's a very religious or an ideology which is based on self-understanding as a religious authority. That's why I referred also to the Sanat, which is there in an obviously in an awareness, because it is also the Sanat from the 17th century, the government decree, which grants the privileges to Bodhana, is mentioned in a British report. So here also Malang clearly drew a connection that they are patronized by the state as religious authorities. They perform certain duties in the society, and not only as spiritual guides, but they ensure the upkeep of law and order. And in this self-understanding, they just conflicted with the British because they were denied that role in the society as a religious authority, and the British did not replace them by any other agent. So out of this self-concept, I'd say they started to fight. But again, there are not enough sources to really come to an end here. And yes, maybe there are others. And I think in Bangladesh, maybe you have an idea which could you something add to that?
I think it is a very popular issue in Bangladesh. I think you can find many sources in Bengal.
Mm-hmm. From which period do they date?
I don't know. Would you investigate the Mughal sources in the Persian language? I think,
yeah, we have Mughal sources, yes. Yes, but they are earlier.
Sources, also Mughal sources is useful for this issue.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, yeah, but they are earlier. The Persian sources end before that.
Okay, so, this is a very interesting discussion, but unfortunately we are running out of time, so please join me in thanking Dr. Falasch.